everybody, and I'm sorry I'm having a few internet problems tonight, so I'm hoping very much that we will keep you engaged and connected. And you're up with the B team tonight. Rob Lyman is actually in Kohima as we speak, and so we're on our own. We can do what we like. Charlotte's just told me that he's visited the new Hump Museum for the first time, so that all sounds a lot of fun, and we'll hear more about that from next time. So hello everyone, let's get this show on the road. Welcome to another Kohima Educational Trust webinar, and the first one that we've ever done on a Monday night. Not sure why that's relevant, but what is relevant is it's our 30th webinar, which seems incredible. And I know there are one or two of you tonight who are watching tonight who have watched nearly all of them live. So thank you. And thank you too. Yes, Darren, excellent. You're one of them. And thank you too. If this is your first one, you are even more welcome. And I hope you will become regular viewers in the future. All our webinars are recorded and kept on our website to view any time that suits you. We have built up quite a library now of excellent presentations across a wide range of subjects, all of which can be viewed for free. Now, the reason for the change of day on which to broadcast is that today marks the exact anniversary of the inauguration of the 2nd Division Memorial at Kohima. 80 years ago today, a service was held in Kohima to remember the fallen, and we wanted to provide a moment for everyone to remember that. We also thought it a terrific opportunity to explore the other memorial stones in Kohima, and we are very lucky that Charlotte Carty not only had the idea, but was prepared to do the research and, most importantly, to give the presentation. Before I hand over to Charlotte, a word I would like to add about the Kohima Museum in York. They have been immensely generous with their time and material, providing Charlotte with a great deal of information, which is on hand tonight, and we are in their debt. It is a terrific museum, and if you haven't been, you should go. In fact, our webinar in February will be about the Kohima Museum and the hundreds of interesting artifacts they hold, so please don't miss that one. As I've already said, the earlier viewers, of course, but maybe not all of you, we are without Rob Lyman tonight, sadly for us, but happily for Kohima, that's where he is. But he'll be back with us next time. As always, feel free to use the chat button and the Q&A, and we will try and get to answer any or all of your questions you have at the end. So now over to Charlotte for what is going to be a fascinating presentation.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar tonight. As Sylvia said, in keeping with the current theme of remembrance, after Remembrance Sunday, of course, this past weekend, we thought it would be apt to provide an insight into the many memorials to those who fought at Kohima, in particular in this 80th anniversary year of the battle, and in particular on this 80th anniversary of the unveiling of the 2nd Division Memorial there. Many different units fought through the 3 months of the battle at Kohima, and I personally have not encountered another battlefield with so many monuments to the different units who were involved. Such was the intensity of the fighting in these remote Naga Hills. And before we do go further, I'd like to say my thank yous as well. I will be saying more as I go through the presentation, but at the start, I'd like to say a thank you to the National Army Museum, the Imperial War Museum, the Commonwealth War Grave Commission, and most importantly, the Kohima Museum again, and reiterating it. I would suggest you go and have a look at their fantastic website. And if you happen to see a blog with the name Memorials there, it'll have a striking resemblance to an awful lot of the material in the first half of this presentation. So I'm definitely in a huge debt to Bob White and the Kohima Museum for an awful lot of the material for this evening. So thank you. So of course, one of the most important aspects of remembrance at Kohima is the iconic Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery there. It was started immediately after the battle on the very ground on which the fighting took place. Quite unusual for a Commonwealth War Graves cemetery. It contains 1,420 burials, 330 of those are Indian, 5 Canadian, 3 Australian, and 1,082 British, including two VC winners, John Pennington Harmon of the Royal West Kents and John Randall of the Norfolk Regiment. There is one woman buried at the cemetery, Ethel Carter, who was a nurse. There is also a Naga, Sepoy Saliezu Angami of the Assam Regiment. The cemetery was designed by Colin Sinclair Oakes, who was an engineer, and he had also fought in the Burma campaign. He chose to include the District Commissioner's tennis court into the design, along with the terracing of the original gardens there. The tennis court itself is now marked out with white concrete lines, a haunting reminder of its history. There is even the remnants of a cherry tree which grew on the edge of the tennis court. The tennis court's just to the right of this picture, actually. And this marks the furthest point that the Japanese were able to advance in this sector of the perimeter. Whilst this particular tree was taken, and I understand a sniper actually often was stationed in it, they got no further than this particular tree. They didn't make it across the tennis court any further than this point. The original grave markers were crosses, but they were later changed to the headstones we know today, with their moving epitaphs to those who lie here in peace. In addition to the headstones, there are 917 Sikh and Hindus of the Indian Army commemorated on the Kohima Cremation Memorial that stands at the back of the tennis court. This was an area that was not taken by the Japanese, and it was defended to the last during the siege stage of the battle. At the top of the tennis court is the cross of sacrifice. This is a Latin cross, usually standing on an octagonal stone base with a downward pointing bronze sword. The idea is to link the military and the spiritual aspects of the cemetery. It was designed by Sir Reginald Bloomfield, whose other works include the Menin Gate. But there are many other individual memorials dotted around the battlefield. This is the memorial to the 161 Brigade of the 5th Indian Division who fought here during the siege stage of the battle. The inscription at the top is by Lieutenant John Wright, and it states, "At Kohima in April 1944, the Japanese invasion of India was halted." The memorial no longer looks like that on the photo on the left, but there is a plaque still standing just below the tennis court area of the cemetery, which is in the photograph on the right. This is a memorial to the garrison who fought through the siege of Kohima. It is on the Dimpoor to Imphal Road, and it is just about by the FSD-DIS area of the Kohima Ridge. Listed are the names of those involved in the siege at Kohima. And as I read these out, do notice the size of the units as I'm mentioning them. So it starts with the Assam Rifles. Sorry, I beg your pardon. It starts with the Assam Regiment. And then it moves on to the Shir Regiment. And then we go to the 1 company of the Punjab Regiment, 2 companies of the Burma Regiment, 2 platoons of the Maharata Light Infantry, 3 detachments of the Assam Rifles, and elements of V-Force. It lists signals, 232 line construction section, a detachment of the Burma P&T signals, a detachment of L Corps R signals, a detachment of E Corps R signals. It lists some medical help, field ambulance, a detachment of Indian General Hospital, a field hygiene section. Even catering is mentioned. 1 company CPT, 1 cattle section, 1 bakery section, 1 supply section. There is a Labour Corps mentioned, and at the bottom miscellaneous, which included a 2nd reinforcement camp, Kohima staff, administration, DC Naga Hills, Sir Charles Palsy, and staff. Fascinating how, as the list goes down to the platoon and even the section size, it seems to be acknowledging that there were so few soldiers to defend Kohima at the start of the siege. I assume that these are the odds and sods one reads about when the garrison is mentioned in books. So critical was the situation at the time that anyone capable of bearing arms was called on to do so, often without any training. The plaque also lists that on the 5th of April, the Royal West Kents arrived to take their place in the line of battle during the siege. Just across from the 2nd Division Memorial, at the bottom of the hill, set outside the cemetery itself, is a memorial to the Assam Regiment who fought throughout the siege of Kohima. They were finally relieved on the 20th of April, when they'd been defending the tennis court for 5 days. They had 48 hours rest in Dimapur before returning to the line and battling throughout the remaining 2 months of the fighting, then on into Burma and continuing right up till VJ Day in August 1945. This memorial is that of the Royal West Kents. The middle photograph shows the cross in situ in Kohima with Earl Mountbatten paying his respects. On the left is a photo of the cross being made. The names of the fallen are being inscribed on the cross, including their VC award holder, John Harmon, following his single-handed attack on a Japanese bunker on DIS on Kohima Ridge on the 9th of April. The photo comes from Bob Street's book, The Siege of Kohima, copies of which are available from the KET shop. It recounts his father, Ray Street's, time at Kohima with the Royal West Kents during the siege. The cross no longer stands at Kohima, but the original cross is in the Regimental Museum in Maidstone in Kent. A plaque is on the wall of one of the terraces at Kohima Cemetery. Brigaded with the Royal West Kents were the Punjabs and Rajputs. A separate plaque on the edge of the original ridge commemorates their fallen and those of other Indian units, such as the 1st and 2nd Punjab Regiments, 3rd Madras Regiment, 4th Bombay Grenadiers, 5th Maharata Light Infantry, the 6th Rajputana Rifles, and the 7th Rajputs. There is another plaque erected in memory of the 4th Battalion of the Punjab Regiment, mentioning those killed on DIS on the 13th of May on Kohima Ridge itself, and on Church Knoll on the 29th of May across in Naga village. These sit on the Dimapur to Imphal Road as it winds around Kohima Ridge. I think it's important to note just how many Indian soldiers were involved in this battle, as we've seen over the last few slides. This is the memorial to the Royal Berkshire Regiment, one of the first units into the besieged garrison to relieve that force. They were part of 6th Brigade, and their fighting was mainly on Garrison Hill, in which they saw bitter action. The Berkshires took over from the Royal West Kents, and Major Francis Borshall recalls how my company went into Kohima over 100 men strong and came out at about 60. They lost 52 men in total killed, 15 missing, and 290 wounded. This monument stood originally on Garrison Hill, and the Imperial War Museum has a film showing the memorial in 1944. The top right photograph is a still from this film. The memorial no longer stands at Kohima, and instead there is a simple plaque in the cemetery wall, whilst the Berkshire and Wiltshire Museum in Salisbury holds the original plaque that was on the 2nd Division Memorial at the base of the cemetery. This white memorial stone is on Garrison Hill and remembers the Durham Light Infantry, who were also part of 6th Brigade. It sits at a private compound, that of the Chief Secretary of Nagaland now. The Durhams mainly fought on Kohima Ridge and suffered heavy losses. Lance Corporal Henry Bell recalled a night during an attack when he was with the signallers. He said he was dying for a smoke and he hid under a blanket and to light a cigarette. The company commander shouted, "Who's smoking?" "Me, sir." "Well, for God's sake, light one for me," was the reply. But Bell does go on to say, C Company were just ahead of us. They were overrun with heavy losses. The photo on the right was the Roll of Honour to the fallen, but this is now gone. There are 2 plaques in Durham Cathedral remembering those involved in the fighting at Kohima. This is the monument to the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and sadly, the original no longer stands. On the memorial were the Welsh words, On nid yin offer, meaning, but not in vain. The Royal Welsh Fusiliers were engaged in battle on Garrison Hill and the ridge itself, taking over from the Durham Light Infantry on the 29th of April. B and C companies were on the forward slopes, overlooking the Japanese positions in Kuki Piquet, not 20 yards away from them. Fusilier Harold Jones, a signaller with B Company, recalled the Japanese improving their positions at night and the spoil from the work landing on the Royal Welsh Fusiliers' trenches. Jones himself was severely wounded in the arm one evening and after treatment was placed in a hole dug into the side of a bank without his weapon, awaiting evacuation the next morning. That night, Japanese broke onto Garrison Hill and he saw them running past him. The Fusiliers beat off this attack, but they suffered many casualties, including the signaller who took over Jones's position. 52 men were killed, 35 missing, and 150 wounded. The plaque stands on the terrace in the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery. This is the memorial to the Dorset Regiment, part of the relieving 5th Brigade. It stands near the tennis court, a sector of the battle that was key to this unit. It was the Dorsets who retook the tennis court on the 13th of May in support of Sergeant Waterhouse's tank. The photo in the top right shows the unveiling in 1944, with their Reverend Gus Claxton MC presiding. After the war, at each National Remembrance Day commemoration at the Cenotaph in London, he would preside over his service for the Dorsets once the main events had finished. The main photo is of how the memorial looks today, and there is also a plaque in a small garden of remembrance in the Dorset County town of Dorchester at County Hall to those soldiers who did not return to their home. Also part of the 5th Brigade were the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders. This memorial stands in the Naga village, which the Camerons were tasked with taking. The Camerons left the Demerport to Infal Road on what is known as the left hook. They descended down a steep ravine, across a raging river, and then up a steep bank to the Merrimer Ridge. This operation was conducted at night and barefoot to make as little noise as possible. Now I've read, I think it was in The Forgotten Voices by Julian Thompson, that the men's boots did not actually catch up with them for some time, so it seems much of their fighting was actually done barefooted. On the memorial itself, beneath the kilted piper, are the names of the fallen. The piper plays the lament, Loch Arbor no more, an 18th century work by Alan Ramsay describing a Highland soldier's farewell, doubting if he would return. The service to inaugurate the memorial was attended by the officers and men of the Camerons, but also the local Nagas who had lived in the area. A Naga headman stepped forward, bowed his head, and promised in his own language that his people would look after the memorial. In 2011, the central plaque in the slide here was added, setting out that promise. You can see how the town of Kohima has expanded. The memorial was originally sitting on its own in Naga village, but the town has re-emerged from the fighting and is now thriving. And the memorial is well looked after by the locals who live alongside it. Now we move on to the 4th Brigade, who were mainly involved in the right hook from the Demerport to Infal Road. They went off into the ravines and jungles behind Mount Pulabadzi, which overlooks the town of Kohima. First we have the Royal Norfolk Cross. It was designed by Sergeant Curtis, and the men built it and erected it on the road between GPT Ridge and Aradura Spur, the area of the battlefield where they fought, having come from behind Mount Pulabadzi and then having had to climb over Mount Pulabadzi to join in the fighting. It was unveiled by the Divisional Commander Nicholson on the 22nd of October 44 and remembers their fallen, including the VC holder John Randall, who was killed during an attack on the 6th of May, leading his men against a Japanese bunker on Jail Hill. Also part of the 4th Brigade, on the right hook, were the Royal Scots. They had also been involved in various actions on their move up to Kohima itself, taking over positions from the Royal Berkshire Regiment as they moved forward to relieve the besieged garrison. Then they worked round the back of Mount Pullabadzi in support of the Norfolks and were involved in bitter fighting, particularly on the Pimple and then on Aradura Spur, where this memorial now stands. Again, the town of Kohima has expanded, but the memorial is well looked after by the locals living around it. This memorial is to the Queen's Own Royal Regiment and their comrades in arms, the 4th Battalion of the 1st King George V's Own Gurkha Rifles. The original memorial on the right no longer exists on Jail Hill. Instead, the State Police Station is based there. However, a plaque stands in the cemetery at Kohima. The Imperial War Museum has footage of the inauguration of this monument. The Queens joined in the attack on Jail Hill with the Norfolks and the Royal Scots, but they arrived there by a different route. They cut up from the Deanport Road from milestone 42, and they moved cross-country up and down the steep hills as they put in their attack through the middle ground. In the words of one Queen's officer, the Jail Hill position was indeed a tough nut to crack, but it was cracked by the combined efforts of British and Gurkhas detailed for the job. The action proved conclusively the great value of the mutual friendship and spirit of liaison between the two units. And once Jail Hill had been secured, both units moved to support the attack on Naga village. This memorial is to the Reconnaissance Corps. It sadly no longer exists. The Recce Corps were attached to each unit and were often in front of the main body of men, a very dangerous task anywhere, but particularly in the close quarter fighting at Kohima. Other British units were involved in the fighting, and they may have had memorials, but these are the only ones which we currently have. But if anyone knows of more, please do let us know. There are also other memorials at Kohima. So, for example, a beautiful bronze statue to the Assam Rifles. However, we've not included it here as it relates to their work in 1942 in helping the refugees fleeing Burma rather than the Battle of Kohima itself. However, it should be noted that they were also an integral part of the garrison force during the siege stage of the fighting. There is also a memorial to Sir Charles Pawsey we found, but it relates to his work post the war, so that's why it's not included here. However, he too remained throughout the siege at Kohima, despite the military asking him to go. And this was a key factor in the Nagas being so loyal to the Allies during this stage of the battle. There are two other plaques situated in the UK recognising the service of British men fighting at Kohima. On the left is the Lancashire Fusiliers, part of 4th Brigade. This plaque can be found in the British Legion in Salford. 66 men were killed, 220 wounded, and 2 missing during their fighting. The Worcester Regiment were part of 5th Brigade. This plaque remembered the lost in the fighting at Kohima in April on the relief of the siege, and at Marham in June 44, as the Allies started pushing the Japanese from the area. It is in Worcester Cathedral and lists 44 men from the battalion killed in action. 2 miles from Kohima in the Angami village of Jotsima is the Angami village of Jotsima. It is where Brigadier Warren, commander of the 161 Brigade, made his headquarters when he could not access the town of Kohima in April when the Japanese had encircled it. It was from here that the Royal Artillery laid down vital and extensive fire in support of the ridge, Kohima Ridge. Just above the town, at the top of the ridge, is a monument to the Japanese who fought at Kohima. It commands a magnificent view of Kohima Ridge and indeed marks a Japanese position that many in the Allied ranks at the time did not know about. There are extensive Japanese bunkers still visible across the area, which are very well preserved. There are also a number of memorials to individuals closely linked to the battle. This is the monument to Major General Grover, GOC of the 2nd Division. It was erected near the village of Jotsima in 2014 by the local villagers to honour him. The stone itself is 15.5 feet tall. And this is a stone to the memory of Brigadier Warren, or Daddy Warren, who is known, the commander of 161 Brigade. It was erected midway between the Kohima Ridge and Naga village. Sadly, Warren was killed in an air crash on the 9th of February 1945 as he flew between Kalenyo and Jorat, and he has no known grave. And of course, in the Dean's Garden at York Minster here in the UK, we have a replica of the 2nd Division Memorial which stands at Kohima itself. Every July, the KET organise a commemoration at the Minster to remember those involved in the conflict in the Naga Hills. Actually, this year it's just going to be in June. We are having it at on the 26th of June. So please join us on the 26th of June in York this year. One thing you should note from the past few slides are the stones, these huge stone monoliths, which have been used for some of the memorials. In fact, the use of monoliths in Naga culture is a subject of extensive academic study. And just last month, another paper was published, this time by Alok Kumar Kunugu. And we are grateful to a number of Nagas who have helped provide information for tonight's webinar on the stone monoliths and how the 2nd Division Memorial was actually erected. So thank you, Nino, Karen Saye, and Ilone Kriko of the World War II Peace Museum in Mao, Manipur. Your detailed and insightful input has been invaluable. These stones are central to the beliefs and culture of the Nagas. It is an ancient tradition to use them, and they can be found all over Nagaland, with many being thousands of years old. These stones were considered sacred and believed to possess spirits. They were believed to talk to each other at night, and women were not allowed to climb on them. Dragging the stones to the village was associated with the rituals around drinking rice beer and remaining chaste. There are many uses for the stones. Some mark tribal territories, others are used for village rituals, including celebrating those who have completed the feeding ceremony of the Feast of Merit. This is where a Naga hosts a feast for the whole village. Some stones represent wealth and prosperity. Others recognise important people in the community. Whilst these stones can, to the Western eye, look like gravestones, this is not usually their purpose. They are to recognise and acknowledge those who have contributed to Naga society in an important way. And that leads us on to the 2nd Division Memorial itself, back at Kohima, at the foot of Garrison Hill. We're now looking at one of the early drawings for the design of the 2nd Division Memorial itself, unveiled this day 80 years ago at the foot of Garrison Hill. It was designed by Lieutenant James Ferry, or Jamie Ferry, who was a Royal Engineer. He was, in fact, part of the team who hand-winched Sergeant Waterhouse's tank up Garrison Hill that led to the successful attack on the tennis court on the 13th of May and turned the tide of the battle. This April, we were fortunate enough to meet his son, Alistair, on the tennis court at Kohima, quite by chance, carrying this poster. Alistair has been so generous in providing copies of his father's drawings, memorabilia, and his diaries and sketches, and has allowed us to use those tonight. So a huge thank you to Alistair. Alistair recalls his father's story of how the memorial came about. It seems to have originated from a discussion between the men of the Royal Engineers Battalion and their chaplain, the Reverend Frank McLaughlin MC, whilst they were fighting around Marham. This sketch is of the Reverend McLaughlin and was actually drawn by Jamie Ferry. Ferry was an excellent cartoonist as well and would draw images of the soldiers in his unit for them to send home to the families so that they could see how they looked after the fighting in the Far East. Back at Marham, one day the officers of the Royal Engineers were all grouped together when a mortar exploded amongst them. Their CO, Major Langdon, was killed, but his body had shielded all the other men who were unscathed. High above the spur above them was a large Naga standing stone. The Reverend sought to use the stone as a monument to their fallen CO and the men of the 2nd Division. The local Nagas were in agreement, and so works to move the stone began. Sergeant Norman Harris of 506 Field Company tells the story in Leslie Edwards' book, Kohima, the Furthest Battle. The stone monolith was about a mile from the road up a very steep slope. a road had to be cut zigzag up the hill by a bulldozer, which allowed the Army Ordnance Corps to get a Scammell lorry and huge winch in place. The sappers started digging the stone out, estimated to be at about 17 tons. And whilst it was carefully being laid flat, the divisional commander, Nicholson, happened to be driving by. The men were somewhat caught out because they couldn't really let go of the ropes. Otherwise, there would have been a disaster. But the divisional commander was not best pleased, as he felt he had not been recognised in the correct way as set out in the King's rules and regulations. Continuing on, though, the sappers placed the stone on some rollers, some teak tree trunk rollers, and this was zigzagged down the hill, using the winch to hold the stone back from falling into the many ravines. Eventually, it reached the Infal Road, where a tank transporter, like the one in this picture, was waiting. The Scammell lifted the stone onto the transporter, and the stone was secured with ropes, and it started its journey to the centre of Kohima, with 2 sappers as traffic control. The road was very windy, and at one point the transporter's rear wheel fell into one of the culverts. This moved the stone, which broke free of its rope and ended up in the ditch. And as it was now getting dark, the sappers and driver settled themselves down under the transporter for a long and bitterly cold night. In the morning, they joined forces with an Indian unit nearby who was serving hot curry stew and hot tea. The Scammell arrived back later in the morning, and they lifted the stone back onto the transporter, and the stone continued on its way into Kohima. At Kohima, the stone was lifted off the transporter adjacent to the foot of Garrison Hill, and Harris then says, "We never found out how the Naga tribesmen pushed, manhandled, or dragged the huge headstone up the hill. However, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission kindly sent us a video enlightening us as to what was involved."
The Japanese advance was finally halted here among the Naga hills of northern India. The raised area bearing the cross of sacrifice is a tennis court. This is in Kohima Cemetery. On either side of the court, the 2 armies faced one another. The tide turned exactly here, and the Indian and British armies won a famous victory. On the 2nd Division's memorial are the moving words, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today." When all mechanical methods failed to raise the memorial stone to its final resting place, it was the Naga hillmen who combined to solve the problem in an altogether simpler and effective way. A roughly hewn stone, a local tradition, bearing its appealing inscription, went on its way. In 1 month, as many as 45,000 people visit Kohima Cemetery.
Fascinating. 200 Nagas were involved in that particular operation. They were offered payment for their services, but they refused. And here is an early photograph of the 2nd Division Memorial soon after it was inaugurated. This area just below the stone is a traffic control point. You wouldn't be able to take this photograph now, not without taking your life into your hands. It's an extremely busy junction in the middle of Kohima. It's still the main road between Myanmar and India. It's quite interesting also, though, to get an idea of the topography of the place. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner a local Naga walking along the road, and it gives you an idea of quite the steepness of some of these hills and slopes. And the army sent out a questionnaire about the construction of the Kohima Memorial, and here is a copy of Jamie Ferry's responses. I particularly enjoyed question 3, how did you become involved in the construction of the monument? And Ferry's answer, well, I designed the monument and I saw it only after it had been built. Question 4 asked, what would you describe as the most difficult part? And Jamie Ferry answered, I believe the Nagas pulled the stone into position when all mechanical means had failed. But my personal favourite is question 9. In what terms would you describe the contribution of the Nagas? And Ferry's one-word answer, magnificent. And here we are, the 18th of November 1944, 80 years ago to this day. This is the memorial sheet, the original memorial sheet from the service, held with Field Marshal Slim in attendance. This service sheet is actually the property of Andrew Hunter, one of the trustees of the Kohima Educational Trust, left to him by his father, Major C.D. Hunter, MCTD, of the Cameron Highlanders. He is indeed the Hunter of Hunter Hill fame in Naga village, and where he led the attack in that sector. The first hymn that day was for all the saints. It was followed by Psalm 46, God is our refuge and strength, and ever-present help in trouble. And the lesson was then read by the Divisional Commander Nicholson, and it was Revelations 21, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The hymn, O Valiant Heart, followed the prayers, and then the unveiling itself, with the lament played by the pipes of a Scottish regiment, which we believe are the Camerons. Then there was the last post, the actual unveiling by Slim himself, the dedication, and the reveille. The final hymn was, O God, our help in ages past, with the national anthem and blessing finishing the service. On the back page of this service sheet, there is briefly a description of the battle, and it includes a tribute to the Nagas as the stretcher bearers, porters, and guides throughout the battle, along with an acknowledgement that victory could not have been won without them. Now, this memorial sheet, service sheet, is actually on the Kohima Educational Trust website, with each page as a PDF for those who'd like to look at it in more detail. And here we have 2 photographs of the 2nd Division Memorial, one on the left shortly after it was unveiled and the one on the right in 2023. The stone itself is 16 feet high, 3 feet wide and 18 inches thick. And you can see in the semicircle behind the monument, they are the rolls of honour of the regiments involved in the battle. One last point to consider with the 2nd Division Memorial is the epitaph. It was penned by John Maxwell Edmonds. He was a classics scholar who, during the war, worked for the forerunner of GCHQ. And according to the GCHQ website, in February 1918, Edmonds published a dozen epitaphs, including, When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrows, these gave their today. Slightly different to the one we know today. It was published in 1920 with a typo where they changed the plural tomorrows to singular. And actually Edmonds was slightly annoyed by this. But it got some traction and he became less frustrated as more and more people started to use it in remembrance services around the world. However, Edmonds was still frustrated that many said he'd only translated a Greek epitaph, that of Simonides, when he was honouring the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae against the Persians. And whilst Edmonds acknowledged that this had been an inspiration, he maintained his original version was an original work. There is also one small controversy in the British press in the 1980s regarding the wording on the 2nd Divisional Monument. The Daily Telegraph published the epitaph using the word there tomorrow, and of course much correspondence ensued. But the Telegraph defended itself by producing the photograph on the left here, which uses the words there, as you can see, there tomorrow. It is interesting that it has changed at some point to the epitaph we all know today. But whatever the wording or the exact origins of the epitaph, the sentiments of 80 years ago are still as true then as they are today. We will remember them. Thank you.
Wow, Charlotte, that was brilliant. Thank you very, very much indeed. And some of the photographs and certainly the video footage you found and have been lent and allowed to use has been really, I think, extraordinarily interesting. And I'm sure everybody along with us tonight thinks the same. I haven't been following the chat. Are there any, I'm just checking it now to see if there are any questions, particularly that anybody would like to ask. We can certainly pick it up in email afterwards. So, you know, we don't have to do it tonight unless there's anything particular. As I said, I'm very grateful to Charlotte for having put this webinar together. It's been a lot of work and it, as I say, fascinating. So now the KET plug, and our shop continues to offer ideas for Christmas, but we have a unique item this year, definitely not on the high street offering. Here is the one and only gold 3D printed Spitfire Christmas tree decoration, which no tree will be complete without, and it joins the aerodrome of Hurricanes and Dakotas from previous years. Our bookshops range continues to grow, particularly with titles that can't necessarily be found through regular bookshops. I was delighted to be introduced earlier this year to Liz Lockhart-Muir, whose mother was in the Women's Auxiliary Services in Burma, WASB for short. And Liz's book, based on her mother's diaries, is really excellent, Frontline and Fortitude. We should be bringing you a webinar on the WASBs early next year, which Liz will give. Soldier Poets has been put together by Bob Cook and Robin McDermott and is a wonderful collection of poetry written by soldiers who were in the campaign. Copies can be bought from the museum and from the KET store. And The Jungle War, I wanted to mention, it's a children's book written in support of the Gurkha Welfare Trust and is a terrific addition to, or should I say introduction to what conditions were like and what the Gurkha soldiers had to go through. Do have a look at our online shop, as there are lots of other items for sale, Naga shawls, scarves, bags, all of which have been made in Naga homes and purchased by us in Nagaland. And as the 80th anniversary year draws to a close, and I wonder how many of you watched the Festival of Remembrance last week at the Albert Hall, when Kohima was particularly remembered by Ray Street's granddaughter. And we want to remember as many people as we can and record those memories for posterity. We have invited our supporters to send in stories that your veteran relatives will have handed down so that they can be collected in one place. And thanks, I wanted to say thank you to all who have already contributed to this programme. I'm afraid we're slightly behind in the editorial department, but we will start to collate in the next week or so and are aiming to have it available online during December, or certainly by the end of December. But it is to be a continuing live digital collection that can be added to as we go along, and we're still happy to receive contributions for as long as you would like to send them. We have our spring programme of webinars all confirmed, which can be found on our website, but we'll be kicking off in the new year on the 16th of January, when Richard Duckett will be presenting the SOE in Burma. Rob Lyman will be back in the saddle, and we look forward to welcoming all of you again. But in the meantime, have a wonderful festive season. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good night.